So in this chapter, we study the fiscal policy, right? This can be summarized by this diagram. I mean, in terms of understanding fiscal policy, it can be summarized this diagram. But however, I want to emphasize to get here, it took us some effort. And for macroeconomists, actually took generations to really understand, right? So what effort we have to make so that we came up with this diagram? So there, at least there are two efforts, big efforts. Number one, we need to understand how to measure in our economy, right? Because look at here, so on the horizontal line, you have real GDP. On the vertical line, you have price level, right? And then, so in the middle, you have long-run aggregate supply. So that just means you need to understand how to measure in many different things, including GDP, but in GDP, including expenditure, income, and product, right? And then price level, so this aggregate price level. And finally, this long-run aggregate supply, there are a couple of important things. One is what determines the production. So we talk about economic growth, we talk about aggregate production. Okay, among those factors, there's one is particularly relevant, which is labor supply, right? Because remember, so the long-run aggregate supply, this is the potential, meaning, so the unemployment rate is at the natural rate, meaning what that means, meaning, so this is with some frictional and structural unemployment, right? So this is the first big task we have to achieve, so that we can come up with some numbers, or so we can properly tell where we are in terms of price and real GDP. Now, the second thing we achieve is have to derive this AD and AS model, right? So the aggregate demand decline with price, and aggregate supply in the short run is rising with aggregate price. That's the second thing we achieve. Now, with this in mind, and then so we start to explore or try to understand what causes the fluctuation of our aggregate economy, or in other words, what caused the recession. Okay, and finally, so with those as a preparation, finally, and what we can do is we can understand, oh, so what happens if there is some recession, okay, and what the government can do, right? Like here, so clearly we are in a recession. Clearly we are in a recession, right? So now with this recession, what we can do? So yes, we can wait the economy to respond to adjust, but alternatively, we can let the government to step in. So essentially, the government is going to lift this up, right? And then, so in contrast, if there's inflationary gap, then the government can help to push down or to cool down the economy, right? So that's what we have learned so far, okay? And then the last of things we discussed in last lecture is about three critiques regarding to the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policy. Someone arguing government spending always crowd out private spending. It just says, okay, if the government spend more, and then it will leave less for the private sector to spend, right? But the answer to that is sometimes it could be the case. So the demand hasn't been fully utilized, like this background picture says. Okay. Now the second argument against, or second critiques regarding to expansion of fiscal policy is that government borrowing crowd out private investment borrowing or private spending. Why? The argument goes as, so the money available in the financial market is limited. If the government borrow more, and then there's less money available for the private sector borrow. But the answer to that is, this is similar to the first one. So we can potentially make the size of the economy bigger if we allow the government to borrow and to spend. Okay. And also evidently, so in 2020, so the government has a massive stimulus plan. The borrowing rate in the financial market didn't go down. Oh, sorry, didn't go up instead of go down. So that just implies, okay, there are plenty of things for the private market borrow. Now, the third claim actually is named after Ricardo. It's called Ricardian equivalence. So essentially it says it's the government borrow and spend to stimulate the economy in the current period. Okay, that is going to force the private sector to cut their spending today. Why? Because the private sector, they're going to focus or they're going to foresee or they're expecting in the future, the government must raise tax to pay for the deficit. Right? But then the answer to that is simply the households may not as smart as this theory predicts. Okay, or they are not as disciplined as the theory requires, right? Because the households need to forecast what's going on in the future, and then so take the proper action, meaning so save, reduce consumption. Okay, but in reality, so the households may not that discipline or may not that they don't have this calculation capacity, and furthermore, some cases households may be credit constrained, meaning they really don't have money to spend. Now, if the government gives them money, and then they must spend. This is like happening in 2020, right? Yes, there's some save, but there are lots of households, they instead save, they just spend all the money the government gives. So those are three critiques, right? So besides those critiques, certainly we have some answers to these critiques. There are some things we must be careful about fiscal policy. Actually, this is a big difference when we compare fiscal policy and the monetary policy we're going to study in the next chapter. Okay. So in terms of fiscal policy, usually there are significant lags in its use, or sometimes take a while to see the fiscal policy has a real impact on our macroeconomy. There are three reasons. Reason number one, it takes time for us to collect data and then to know precisely we are in a recession or we are in an expansionary gap, right? As we studied earlier, so you can see, so because we need to, in order to get the precise measure, it takes lots of effort. And usually it takes time to feel like, okay, we are in a recession. Okay. So now the second thing that take time is just for us take time to develop a plan. Like, so for example, if the government has or want to have a rescue plan, right? So they have lots of discussion in Congress. They have lots of discussion in different government agencies, right? To understand the cost and the benefit or what kind of action we should take. Now, the third one, even though, so they have a plan, the plan was presented or discussed in Congress, okay, and passed a law, but still it's going to take time to implement the actual plan. Like, say, for example, the money needs to go to certain part of the economy, right? So that's going to take time, right? So take all things together. So the fiscal policy usually take a while to actually have real impact or actual impact on the real economy. Now, this is more or less like, so in the ocean, you want to change the course of a big cruise, right? So this is much more difficult comparing you just change the direction of your bicycle, okay? Because there's like lots of inertia, basically. Now let's look at this practice question regarding to contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy, A, is most helpful for restoring an economy to the potential output level when there's a recessionary gap. Is that correct? That's exactly opposite, right? So contractionary fiscal policy, usually you need to reduce spending, increase tax. B, shift aggregate demand to the right, restore the equilibrium. So this is also not correct, right? C, often cause inflation. This is not right, right? So D, if effective, shift aggregate demand to the left, resulting in a reduction in aggregate demand. Okay, so that's correct, right? So D is correct. Make sure you understand what happens if there's an expansionary fiscal policy. It should happen exactly opposite. Right. Now let's look at another one. Which of the following statement is true, holding everything else constant? A, an economy can eliminate inflationary gap by increasing government spending. No, that's going to make things worse, right? B, expansionary fiscal policy refers to increase in tax. That's not correct, right? So increase in tax is called contractionary. C, when potential output is greater than actual output, the economy potential output is greater than, right? So the economy is in a recession, right? Because you produce less than you can potentially produce. D, when short run aggregate supply intersect AD to the right of long run, then the economy receive actually no. So you are producing more than you potentially can produce. So you are in the inflationary gap, right? Okay, so the answer is C. Okay, now we can look at some actual economy. Okay, so let's look at a few examples of expansionary fiscal policy. So the first one is American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. So that was the answer to the financial crisis, right? So let's look at it one by one. Tax cut, this is expansionary, right? Transfer to state and local government, this is also expansionary. Transfer to persons, to individuals, right? So it boosts up your disposable income. And lastly, infrastructure and other spending. So this is essentially government spending, right? So you can see each of those four categories was designed to boost up the aggregate demand. Okay. Now we can look at CARES Act. What is CARES Act? So that's 2020. That was a response to a big recession caused by COVID-19, right? So now the total package is much bigger. This is 2.3 trillion compared to the previous one. Let's look at the previous one. So the previous one, this is around 800 billion. Now the 2021, the package is more than double, right? So now let's look at right-hand side. Maybe it's the left-hand side. So it's the same thing, right? So source, so they have direct payment, unemployment benefit. So direct payment means what? So essentially the money goes to either the small business or households directly. So that's going to boost up the demand. Unemployment benefit, so that just goes to whoever lost their job, right? Now the third one is tax break. Essentially it's called the tax. So it could be business, it could be household or consumer directly, right? Now they also have loan of almost 900 billion, and in the parentheses, it includes up to 366 billions of forgiven. What that means? That means maybe there's a small business and suddenly they have to close their door, but they have a loan to pay, right? You different type of loan, and then so the government says, okay, so maybe we can just forgive your loan to help them to survive. Right? Why they want to help them to survive? Just in case when the economy return to normal later, and then so the business is still there, and then the business still can generate jobs. All right, so that's why they have loan forgiveness, and that's why they have loan, just to help them to survive. Right. Next one, grant. This is kind of similar to loan. Now, maybe there's an additional requirement or string attached with the money. And then lastly, other spending. These are actually, most of them goes here, health providers. Right? So you can think about civic example. So maybe the government order some COVID-19 vaccines, right? And then so there's give this to either CVS, Walgreens, or hospital. So they provide free vaccinations to the general public, right? So this health provider. And also they have like FEMA money, right? So this is an emergency. All right, so on the right-hand side, you can see what are the recipients. But apparently, households, that's a big one. And that's small and large business, that's another big one, right? So the households, so make sure they can what? They can generate demand. And the business, make sure they can survive. And then they can keep generating jobs, right? And so in this particular pandemic caused recession, there are two particular spending. One is airline, the other is health provider, right? Why? Because this is like a pandemic cost, right? So people stop travel and people need to get vaccination. And in that sense, this is slightly different from the 2009, or this goes back here, 2009, this American Recovery and Reinvestment Acts. So they have similar sense. Okay, let's give you example. So the money goes to airline in 2020, and then back in 2009, the money went to automakers, like auto manufacturers, like we saw earlier, like GM, right? And similarly, so the money goes to health provider in 2009, and then some of the money maybe goes to the financial sector. All right, so just give you a comparison. So in either case, you can see the government took lots of effort and trying to stimulate the economy by carrying out massive expansionary fiscal policy through tax cut, through direct payment, and through government spending. Okay, all was designed to lift off aggregate demand, okay, to rescue the economy from deep recession. Now, we are going to look at a multiplier to understand the net impact of expansionary fiscal policy. But here we are also going to see, even though the same money spent, like say for them 100 million, 100 billion, whatever. But then by using different instrument, I mean, this is from the point of view of the government, the net impact on the real economy is going to be different. So this is the main lesson we are going to study, okay? So this multiplier more or less coming from older study. And essentially that's coming from marginal propensity to consume. $1 I earn, I'm going to spend, okay? And then there's like a domino effect. Okay. So this is something we have discussed earlier, right? So, okay. So now here I'm going to show you two types of spending the government can do, or two types of action the government can do. But then by looking at net impact on the economy, you're going to see they're quite different. But in any case, so first we have this multiplier, right? 1/1 minus MPC, right? So this is the same as we studied earlier. Okay. Now let's see how that affects, or how different choice from the government will have different impact on the real economy. Okay. Civic example, the government want to spend 50 billion. So this is a stimulus plan, or this is a stimulus package. But then the government has two choices, loosely in two categories. One, they are going to have a tax cut, or equivalently, so the government can increase transfer, meaning so they just give you money. 50 billion will directly go to households, either through tax cut or through increase in transfer, meaning so effectively this government can send you a check. Alternatively, the government can spend this 50 million themselves. All right, like say for example, back in 2020, the government say, okay, so I'm going to spend 50 billion to order some vaccination. All right, just give example. But actually, so the government did something else. Oh, sorry. The government did more than just order some vaccination. Right? All right, so now we need to understand the difference, and in particular, the different impact on the aggregate economy. But this is the difference between these two actions, right? So how they are different. So these tables kind of summarize the main difference, right? To start with, let's say the marginal propensity to save is 0.5, but that's essentially just says the marginal propensity to consume equal to 0.5 as well, right? Because these two add up equal to 1. All right, now let's see, so how are their impacts? Let's start with this column. Okay, in this column, the government is going to spend their money directly. Okay, 2 examples. Either the government orders some vaccination and provide to the general public, or alternatively, the government can initiate some massive spending program. So for example, they renovate the highway. So for example, they just build out some green energy facilities. All right, so this is a give example. What would be the impact on the actual economy or real economy? In the initially or in the first round, so this 50 billion immediately becomes aggregate demand. The GDP immediately increased by 50 billion, right? So this is the first step. Now, if we comparing alternative, okay, in the alternative, the government give households 50 billion to spend. This is either through tax cut or through increase in transfer. Now, in the first round, you already see the difference. What's the difference? Households has 50 billion. Are they going to spend everything? No. Okay. How much are they going to spend? 25. Coming from where? Coming from this number, right? So they're going to save 50%. They're going to spend 50%. And the 50, that's the additional income they have. And now they're going to spend 25. Right? So now immediately you can see in the first round, there's a difference in terms of their impact on real GDP. But then throughout or right after the first round, everything is the same. Only difference is the magnitude. Right? Now, in this choice, I mean, if the government initiate the government spending initially, so now you have 50, 25, 12.5, so on and so forth. Now this one, you have 25, 12.5, so on and so forth. Now, if we add this column together, you have 100. But if you add this column together, you have 50. In a very crude way, so essentially the difference coming from where? Coming from you are missing this one. All right. So the main lessons we learned from this exercise is the following. Okay. The tax change or transfer is less powerful comparing to government spending. But here, so there's some caveat or there's something we need to be cautious, right? And here we assume the government, what kind of assumption we need to assume regarding to the government? So we must assume here, this government is reliable. It could be the case, okay, the government is going to spend the money on something is very wasteful. In the economic literature, they have the name, it's called white elephant. What is that white elephant? Does anyone heard about a white elephant? But intuitively, so white elephant, do you think it's rare or not? It is rare. It is rare. But white elephant can attract a lot of attention, right? If you see a white elephant in the zoo, it's going to draw lots of curiosity, right? It's very interesting to watch. But other than that, is that something useful? No. Okay, so actually white elephant refers to some massive government spending or government project. It's only useful for seeing, nothing else. Right? And then so the example could be, just think about safe example. If the government spent $10 billion to build a very fancy airport in safe example Lincoln, do you think that help the economy or no? Not really. So that's the example. If you still don't get it, maybe just think about, okay, so like if the government spent 100 billion to build like a world-class airport in Hastings, that's probably a better example. Will that help? Not at all, right? But then so here, the assumption we need is this 50 billion actually goes to somewhere really need the money. And then so you have this chain rule to help the economy, right? So if you think, okay, so let's go back to the example I just gave to you. The government spent 100 billion to build a world-class airport in Hastings. The real impact on the economy is going to be very small because in the first round, so pretty much everything was wasted. Does it make sense? Okay, here, so we say the government spending has bigger impact on tax cut. We have implicit a big assumption, which is the government know how to spend the money wisely. And also the government must spend the money very responsible, in a very responsible way. If that's not the case, and then you cannot count on government spending has bigger impact on our economy compared to tax cut. Because usually households is going to be responsible, right? So that's kind of the assumption. That's a more reasonable assumption to assume households are responsible. Or market usually works better. All right. To summarize the main lessons we learned, kind of given by this sentence. The size of the shift of aggregate demand curve depends on the type of fiscal policy. So here, shift essentially is what? It's like a multiplier, right? So if you increase spending or if you reduce tax, you shift off, right? By how much the shift will happen is going to depend on the type of fiscal policy, right? And from the previous slides, from the exercise, we can see changes in government purchase have a more powerful effect on the economy than equal size change in tax or transfer. Again, just keep in mind, here we assume the government is responsible. The government is smart. The government is reliable. If those are not satisfied, and then this statement doesn't hold, right? Furthermore, I want to emphasize, in reality, it's a little bit more complicated than the simple example we have discussed. Okay, in the simple example, the government spending or the government revenue coming from, we call it lump sum tax. And what is lump sum tax? The main thing is that it's not distortionary. And what that means, to give you an example. So lump sum tax is a tax that is going to charge regardless who you are. But in reality, usually tax is proportional. It's proportional to your income, proportional to your consumption. The more you make, the more higher tax you pay. And then the difference is, so the lump sum tax won't destroy your choice. Because regardless how much you work, how much you consume, how much you save, you pay the same tax. My decision is going to be independent of the tax in lump sum tax. Or lump sum tax won't interfere with your choice. But if it is a linear tax or proportional tax, as we usually see in real world, and then the tax is going to interfere with your choice. And then throughout this multiplier effect or throughout this sequence, the tax is going to create another distortion, or in other words, the net impact on the real economy is going to differ from the simple calculation. So this is something we need to keep in mind. Now, we are going to look at fiscal policy through a different aspect. Earlier, we talked about we can characterize fiscal policy by differentiating them into expansionary and contractionary. And here we can differentiate them in terms of automatic stabilizer versus discretionary fiscal policy. What are the differences? The difference is as follows. Maybe just give you an example, it's probably better. Okay. Automatic stabilizer. The good example is unemployment insurance. Okay. And in contrast, discretionary fiscal policy is what? It's an example of Obama stimulus or Biden stimulus plan. What's the difference? The difference is, so this unemployment insurance is kind of written in the law or written in constitution. It's going to automatically apply. Not only it automatically apply, it will also automatically stabilize our economy. How that works? So unemployment insurance basically is going to apply when you lose your job. Now, how that can stabilize the economy? You ask yourself, under which case there are more people demand for unemployment insurance? In recession or in expansion? Recession. Okay, let me write that. So in recession, there were more people will demand for unemployment insurance. Now, this things is there, and in recession, and then automatically there are more people is going to receive transfer from the government. The transfer is going to work through what? Work through this unemployment insurance. That just literally means, okay, so there's a rule there, and then whenever it's needed, it automatically kicks in. Right? So when recession comes, there are more people lost their job, and then more people qualify for unemployment insurance. And then there are more transfer coming from the government. More transfer meaning there are more stimulus to the economy. But everything happens automatically. There's nothing you need to do. On the contrary, if we are in the expansion, jobs are plentiful, unemployment rate is low, there are less people demand for unemployment insurance, and then transfer is going to reduce. And then essentially the fiscal policy becomes less expansionary, and even you can classify that as contractionary. Okay, everything happens automatically. There's nothing you need to do because people is going to automatically show up in the Social Security office to claim their unemployment insurance benefit, or automatically there are less people show up to ask for unemployment insurance benefit payment. So again, everything happens automatically without you do anything. But what is discretionary fiscal policy? This is something they need to apply. This is something with some deliberation, like Obama stimulus, like a Biden stimulus, right? So there's a discussion. Should we do this or not? And usually this is a one time, right? So this is a one-time action. Okay. So this is an example. Now we can look at this practice question to understand. Things we just discussed. Holding everything else constant, the multiplier effect for tax or transfer. So that's something we just learned, right? So the impact of tax or transfer. So here, basically, we're just comparing with spending. Let's go one by one. It's the same as a multiplier effect of a change in autonomous aggregate spending. So this autonomous changes autonomous aggregate spending. This is almost equivalent to a change in G. So this is change in the spending. Right? So that just means this is probably going to smaller. Right? It's going to smaller. Right. Now this slide is going to show you this multiplier actually works, or the stimulus actually works. On the horizontal line, this is changes in cyclically adjusted budget balance. But essentially, this just tells you what this tells us. So essentially, this just tells us, if this number is positive, meaning, so you have a government, you have a surplus. If it's negative, goes to negative, and the government has a deficit. But this immediate translate, if it goes to this direction, we have in an expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Go to the right-hand side. So how come you have a surplus? How you're going to change your G, or how you're going to change your tax to have a surplus? Do we have decreased G or increased G to have a surplus? If you increase, okay, so the government's budget is what? So they have income, which is tax, minus G. So that's essentially, that's their budget. If they increase G and these numbers becomes more negative, no? So that means, okay, so in order to increase this total number, make it positive, they must decrease G and increase tax. On the other hand, so this negative means they are going to decrease tax, increase G. So to summarize, okay, so if it goes to this direction, negative, meaning, again, so what type of policy is this? Expansionary or contractionary? Expansionary. If it goes to here, then contractionary. It's very clear, right? So again, let me just erase everything because we understand what this means. Meaning, so along this horizontal line, goes to right-hand side is contractionary. On the left-hand side is what? Expansionary. Now, vertical line is percentage change in GDP. And we clearly can see there's a correlation between your GDP change or growth versus the type of fiscal policy you apply. And what statement we can say? Now I will give you enough explanation. What statement we can say? Is a contraction or fiscal policy better for you in this time period, or a expansion or fiscal policy better for you during this time period? Do you want the economy to grow, or do you want the economy to shrink? Grow. And then you prefer in this region, or in general in this region. In order to be in this region, do you need expansion or fiscal policy or contraction or fiscal policy? Expansionary. Very good. And then to summarize, there are two things. Number one, so expansionary fiscal policy helps you during this time period. And secondly, actually, there is a multiplier, right? The more you go to expansionary territory, the higher your growth rate, right? So one is like qualitatively, if you go to this direction, you're going to experience high growth. The other is quantitatively, this is like a very nice negative, or this very nice curve to show you their relation. The stronger you stimulate your economy, the higher the growth. All right. So this is what we learned from this picture. But then, so what is particular about 2009 to 2013? What happened at that time period? There was a global recession caused by financial crisis, right? So that's what we learned. But then so you may ask your question, if this seems so obvious, we know there's a correlation between fiscal policy you can have and versus your economy. Why not everyone move to here? Why you have some country, particularly like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, why they are here? So if anyone have heard about the term, actually refer those to those countries. P stands for Portugal, I is Ireland, G is Greece, S is Spain. So they are stand out. They are stand out in the sense they are do something is very counterproductive. Counterproductive in the sense so they didn't stimulate their economy. Because here you're supposed to what? You're supposed to increase G, reduce tax. And then so you can go to here, like Switzerland, Sweden, Japan, right? So they help the economy to out of this swamp, out of this deep recession, right? But then so you may wonder, so what happened to those PIG country, like we call the pigs, right? Quote unquote, this refers to they're not smart, right? Why? Why they did what they did? What prevent them to work smartly? Yes. They increase taxes and reduce government spending. But the question is why? This is very counterproductive. The answer is so the government's hand was tied. The answer essentially, this is going to lead to the next topic we're going to go. But here, give you the preview. For those countries, essentially those few countries, they have a lot of government debt. They have accumulated in the past. Okay, their debt is so high such that if they want to borrow more, they have to pay very high interest rate. Very, very high. It's so high such that they really cannot borrow. And how that links to the story we just talked about. So you have tax, you have spending. If there's a deficit, how you can finance additional tax cut, how you can finance additional government spending? Tell me. The only way you can do is what? Getting loan or borrow more. But because in the past, they have accumulated a lot of debt, and the investors, international investors, lose confidence on them. They are not willing to lend to them. The only way they can lend them is to charge high interest rate. But the interest rate is so high, so technically, so they are not able to afford. So that just means, okay, so this is like a virtual cycle, right? So they want to have a deficit. But the only way to run a deficit is take a loan. But the loan becomes so expensive, you just really cannot. But then, so you may want to ask a further question. What brought them to a high debt position? Right? But the answer is simple, right? So usually the debt comes from what? Comes from deficit. And the only answer is they were very irresponsible in the past. Okay, the responsible government should be, okay, they run deficit only when it's necessary. And then they're trying to change the course or reverse that when it's not. So that is to make sure so the debt is manageable. And then in the future, when it's necessary or when it's need, they can borrow again. Does it make sense? This is like in the individual, right? So when you are in a distress, when you need money, like when you're like college student, you borrow. But then later, so when you graduate and then you start to pay off your debt. And then in the future, so when you need to borrow again, so for example, so you need to finance a house, you have a good credit, you have a good reputation, and then people willing to lend to you. Otherwise, people won't help you when you in a great need. The same logic applies to the government. All right. Now this just go to the last topic, right? So actually, I give you lots of preview, give you lots of insight already, right? So where we start? We started with government budget, right? And this government budget is going to link with these things, national debt, right? So if you're interested, you can click this link to see what is the actual number right now. But we kind of pretty much, we knew what's happened, right? So this number is very, very high for the United States. This has been used by media, has been used by politicians, right? Okay, so this is a high number. But what brought us to here? And what is going to be the long-term consequence? Those are the questions we need to discuss. But from the discussion we have in these slides, you have a sense already, right? So why we have a huge debt is because we have to finance the deficit. But why we have a deficit? Usually it's because we have an expansionary fiscal policy. On top of that, usually it's because you have a war to finance. Just think about World War II. Just think about Vietnam War. Or think about today, so the Ukraine war, right? So they need to fight the war, and then so they have limited tax revenue. What they can do, they borrow. So that's how we end up with the debt. Okay. And then we can look some algebra. Okay, it's government. Government also have saving. Saving coming from where? So this is their income, this is tax. So they're spending. They have direct spending, they have transfer. And at the end, so the net term from this formula and give you the saving of the government. But it could be positive, could be negative. If it's positive, it is a saving. If it is negative, it's a deficit. Right. So the value of this term also will link with the type of fiscal policy you're going to carry out. And usually, if it is an expansionary fiscal policy, now we look at this equation. If it is expansionary fiscal policy, mean what? This is going to decrease. This is going to increase. This is going to increase. And then, so the expansionary fiscal policy usually is make this number more negative, or usually more likely to lead to a deficit. On the other hand, if it is a contraction of fiscal policy, this is going to increase, this is going to decrease, this is going to decrease. And then this becomes more likely to be positive, or you're more likely to run a surplus. Right? So first, this is what that means. But secondly, again, so like I said many times, so if the government run a deficit, how they can finance this? They must borrow. On the other hand, if the government run a surplus, what they can do with this money, they're going to lend out, meaning they have saving, right? So that's how this link with their debt. But over time, if you keep running a deficit, meaning your debt is going to accumulate. On the other hand, if you just keep running a surplus, you're going to accumulate larger and larger assets. All right. This is the budget of the United States since 1964. What do we learn from here? Oh, by the way, here, this is just budget deficit. Okay. Positive meaning, so actually the government running a deficit. Now, throughout our history, there's only during Clinton administration, we run surplus. But what this means, this immediately means if we have another figure, debt as ratio of GDP, what are you going to expect? So the debt over GDP is going to increase over time. Actually, that was what actually happened. The other things I want to bring to your attention is, so if you look at the deficit, and particularly so how this deficit interact with recession or business cycle. And clearly you can see, so whenever there's a recession, oh, by the way, those are recessions, okay? Whenever there is a recession, deficit increase, right? It pretty much, this happens throughout history. And why? This is obvious, because of the expansion of fiscal policy, or because of the Keynesian view of our economy, right? So whenever there's a recession, we must have expansion of fiscal policy. If there's a expansion of fiscal policy, immediately that's going to bring us some deficit, right? So these things are linked with each other. Okay. Right. Not only because we have expansionary fiscal policy, like discretionary, also because there's an automatic stabilizer through unemployment. What's the logic? So whenever there's a recession, unemployment rate is going to, what happened to unemployment? Go up. If unemployment rate go up in recession, what happened to the unemployment insurance benefit? The government handout is going to go up, right? It's going to go up. Let's write down unemployment benefit will go up. So if this go up, actually this part of a government transfer, right? And then that's going to lead to more deficit. That's why, so these two kind of catch with each other. Right, or in other words, there are two reasons why deficit increase in recession. First, usually the government will carry out some expansionary but discretionary fiscal policy. On top of that, additionally, so the government usually has some automatic stabilizer. So those things will increase spending. And those things will push up deficit when recession comes. So there are two reasons, right? And here we have discussed, right? So there's like discretionary, right? There's a discretionary and automatic. So that's why sometimes we also look at cyclically adjusted budget balance. What that means, we just tease out those automatic stabilizer, right? Because this automatic stabilizer, in some sense, is not a choice of the current government. And then we tease that out. So we get a cyclically adjusted budget balance. That is the current government active choice. Okay, so that's what this means. Now, like I said, so if there's a deficit, how you can finance this deficit? The answer is bond. Or you can say it's the government take a loan. Take a loan from whom? From us, right? Could be domestic us or could be international us, right? So this is a perfect example. So they need to fight a war. But this war, you can generalize this war to different things. So this can be a physical war, like a World War I. But this war can be what? Can be COVID or pandemic. Also, this war can be what? Can be a recession. Recession is also a war, right? So you can generate the notion of this war, right? But in either case, okay, so we need borrow to finance the deficit, and then over time this is going to accumulate. That's how those peaks country they facing high debt. It's so high such that they cannot borrow anymore, right? Okay, now let's look at this practice. Holding everything else constant, the government deficit increase during recession. Is it correct? Yes, right? Tends to increase during expansion. No, except if the government had some expansionary fiscal policy during expansion. It happened indeed. So President Trump, so he had expansionary fiscal policy during his term, even though the economy was in expansion. There are good reasons, right? So political reason, but that's probably just beyond pure economics. But anyway, that happened, right? C will increase if the government pursuing expansionary fiscal policy. That's also correct, right? Usually these two are linked together. So an answer is D. Both A and C, they are correct. Right. Now, the last things we're going to discuss is regarding to budget issue, right? So usually people was discussing whether the government should have a balanced budget or not. But what does balanced budget means? The balanced budget means, let's go back to previous slides. Basically, it means this equal to 0. Balance means you have balance between your income and your spending. This is balanced. Okay, so I need this equation. Let's go back to here. So just write down. I will need that later. But first, let's see, so why people advocate for balanced budget. Some people arguing for an annually balanced budget. But then, so what are we going to lose? Let me write down, okay? So if the budget is balanced, means T, which is tax, equal to G plus transfer. This is what they are advocating for. If that's the case, if there's a recession, what will happen? First of all, if there's a recession, usually tax is going to, what happened to tax if there's a recession? No, nothing else. If nothing changed, if there's a recession, how much tax you can collect from the economy? You're going to collect more tax or less? If you do nothing you have done actively. It's going to be less. Why? Because there's higher unemployment rate. Income is going to shrink. The tax base is going to shrink. Okay. So if you pursuing the balanced budget, and then so what do you must do? You must decrease G, decrease transfer, or alternatively, you keep G, keep transfer, and then you must increase tax rate, right? As a matter of fact, that's exactly what President Hoover did back in 1930. But clearly you can see this is going to be counterproductive, right? Okay, this is the first one. But some might say, okay, so we need to balance the budget over the business cycle on average. What that means? That just means in recession, you have a deficit. In expansion, you have a surplus. But then there's another problem. Can we really trust politicians? Right. So what this, okay, so how this slides play out? So the discussion is about balanced budget. If we strictly impose an annual balanced budget, and then so we are going to face this issue. Meaning, so when there's a recession, you don't have the capacity to stimulate, right? But on the other hand, if you say, okay, so we only just loosely requires a balanced budget on average, and then we face another challenge, which is what? The politician, they may not cares about long run budget health. Like an example I give to you. So this happens both for Democrats and Republicans. During President Trump's presidency, so the economy was in expansion and he cut tax. And then during President Biden, so people was criticizing his stimulus was too big, right? So in either case, you can see, so besides the pure economic reason, so they have their political motive to what? To run deficit. Or in other words, we cannot trust politicians to keep long-run budget health. So that's why people say, okay, so we need a balanced budget. But you can see there's a dilemma, right? If you just too tight, you lose your capacity to help the economy. If it's a too loose, and then to the politician, they are going to what? They're going to take advantage of this loose requirement, right? But in either case, but in any case, that's actually what happens. In over long term, usually, so they are running a large and larger debt. That's end up with what happens in those PIGS countries, right? Right. So I think we have talked about this, right? So this is regarding to, that's what we said, right? So this Greece, Ireland, Portuguese, Spain, and Italy. Actually, this more precise, this PIIGS, because there are two I, Ireland and Italy. Right. So essentially what happens is they were not physically responsible. Now, if they were physically responsible, they are trying to balance the budget over long term, meaning they are going to have a reasonable amount of debt. And then so when they really need to stimulate the economy, when they really need to run a deep deficit, what they can do? They can take a loan, they can borrow. But because they were not responsible, the debt is so huge and nobody's willing to lend them when they desperately need help. That was what happens. Right, that's another, that's also a lesson to most economy, right? Right, so but in the United States, right, so but in the United States, we have our own versions, but it's like depending on which states we have. Okay, we depend on which state we have. I'm gonna leave that for you to read. So the last things we can talk about is deficit versus debt. But so it's kind of summarize what we have discussed. So deficit is the difference between spending and tax revenue. Right? Debt is a sum of money the government owns, but usually deficit translate into debt. Right? Because otherwise, how you finance deficit? If you keep running deficit, you're going to make your debt larger and larger. right? And this debt, this is how each country's debt looks like, right? So there's only one country actually they have assets instead of debt, which is Norway. So where we are, like here, so United States, we are here. This is a few years ago. This is a few years ago. And today, this is more than 100%. By the way, so these are just in terms of percent of GDP, right? And Japan has very large debt, but most of them are internal. Okay. The debt, as I said, if you have a too large a debt, and then you're going to have hard time to borrow. And why is that? Because people is going to lose their confidence in terms of your ability to pay off your debt. So you're going to have a hard time, right? Right, so I'm going to stop here for, oh yeah, so one more thing before we go, okay, one more thing. So in terms of debt, there's one thing usually people forget, which is implicit liability. What is implicit liability? This is something you are supposed to be responsible. You are supposed to spend. That means just eventually it's going to show up in your debt. And what a good example of implicit liability. So in the United States, Social Security, Medicare, and particularly these things is going to, the spending will go up over time because people getting older and people living longer. So the Social Security benefit is going to climb up and the Medicare is climbing up. But that eventually is going to translate larger deficit and meaning bigger debt. Okay, so this is implicit liability, right? I'm just going to stop here for today. So essentially, we finished this chapter on fiscal policy. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about money and the monetary policy. That's a different instrument the government can have to help the economy when it's needed, right?